So he gets off the train. I'm getting off. It's snowing, I seem to recall. Puts his hat on. He had a scarf, I think, as well. And I said, anyway, nice to meet you. My name's Mark. He goes, oh, wonderful. My name's Colin. And I'm like, okay, hello, Colin. Nice to meet you. And he walks off. And then someone who was across from me, who was an archaeology student at Cambridge, said, that was Colin Renfrew, you dumb fuck. I was like, no! Oh my God! Hello and welcome back to Watching Brief for the week of the 2nd of December 2024. I'm joined as ever by my co-host, Mr. Andy Brockman, and together our ongoing Watching Brief continues. This week, in no small part, we will be reflecting on the loss of Professor Lord Colin Renfrew, a huge figure in UK and world archaeology, and I think a bit of a legend in his own time, Andy.
Absolutely. I think it is fair to say that he's probably one of the most influential archaeologists of my lifetime, certainly. And in fact, he's probably the first working archaeologist I can remember ever seeing on television way back before I even thought I was going to be joining the profession.
Interesting. Okay. Well,
I'll tell you about that later.
Yeah, and I have an anecdote to share as well, so we will come back to that. But before then, we have a couple of news articles, news lines for you guys to keep an eye on at home. And I'm going to, before we start that, ask that you guys bear in mind your good old archaeological news hounds at this time of year. Remember that we have a Patreon. Remember that we have, or that Andy has a Ko-fi account, and PayPal, etc. Please, sir, it's cold. It's cold.
It's the season of goodwill. Show us some goodwill as we show you lots and lots of goodwill by providing you with all this content free to air.
God bless us, everyone. Yes, exactly. But no. In all seriousness, it would be. What day is it, boy? No, in all seriousness, before we do a full rendition of Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol, your support is always welcome, and the more support we garner, the easier Watching Brief will be to produce and bring to you little nuggets like we are today. So, speaking of news lines to look at and to keep an eye on, we are starting with, I think, the Parthenon Marbles. Are they going home, Andy?
Well, according to the some news outlets like the Telegraph and so on, and the Conservative Party,
they're going.
The far left.
They're going. Sorry.
Far left British Prime Minister.
Oh, I see. Yes.
Copyright Elon Musk.
Yeah.
Keir Starmer. Has capitulated and is about to surrender the Elgin Marbles to the Greeks. Other people would argue that the long-running row between the Greek government and the British government, focused on the Parthenon Marbles in the British Museum, is apparently coming to some sort of conclusion, because there are pretty well-sourced stories that there have been talks between Athens and London, particularly since the Starmer government took over in July, and that a deal to return the Parthenon Marbles to Athens in return for the loan to London of high-end, high-status archaeological material, some of which won't have left Greece before, is on the table, and is, well, as The Guardian put it, talks are, quote, well advanced.
Okay.
Now, this all came to a head yesterday because the Greek Prime Minister was in town. Now, you might remember that the last time the Greek Prime Minister visited London, the then Prime Minister Rishi Sunak had a hissy because his Greek colleague had mentioned in it. A Rishi fit rather than a hissy fit, had a bit of a hissy fit and cancelled a meeting with the Greek Prime Minister because the Greek Prime Minister had mentioned the Parthenon Marbles in a TV interview the day before, and allegedly, according to the British side, they'd agreed not to raise it as an issue because it was basically its catnip to the culture warriors on the right of British politics. this time it was being this story appeared in the Guardian and across other newspapers, but it was actually downplayed by the political players in this. It was the Prime Minister's press spokesperson said that, quote, our position on the Elgin Marbles has not changed, using the phrase the Elgin Marbles, which is interesting. But another source close to the negotiations is quoted in the Guardian as saying the mood music has completely changed. Now, it's pretty well known that chair of the Board of Trustees of the British Museum, George Osborne, wants a solution to this. The new director of the British Museum is not against a solution to this. It's known from comments in the past, and Keir Starmer in the past has talked about a solution to the issue as well. I wrote about it in the pipeline a while back when it was last in the news. So I think, although there was no announcement yesterday, and some people say shock horror, Keir Starmer is going to give away the Elgin Marbles like now, Christmas present for the Greeks. In fact, there's a measured process going on. It appears to be making progress. It appears to be making progress along the lines that have been expected for a long time, i.e. some sort of fudge to get around the British Museum Act, which prevents the British Museum from actually handing over title to objects in its collection. Which might entail the Greeks accepting a long loan or even a permanent loan in the first instance. That's down to the lawyers and also Greek politics.
Yeah. And to be fair, Orthodox Christmas is the 7th of January, so there's plenty of time.
Indeed.
No, it's interesting, and I suppose I'm just curious as to what extent this will help the British Museum's image. We always talk about how whenever the BM is brought up, for example, on ArchaeoSoup social media, there's a long line of people, wryly smiling, raising an eyebrow, saying, oh, the British Museum, the thieves of the world, this kind of thing, even though no Western major museum is untouched, particularly the ones in Europe, by some of these issues. And I think the answer, thinking about it since we were discussing it the other day, has to do with parity, doesn't it? So if Athens is loaning, for example, I don't know, the Mask of Agamemnon to the BM for a period of time, then that is an arrangement in the current day. That's something that's happened in living memory, and actually has a relevant quid pro quo to it. So I think actually it could be, yes, you can describe it as a win-win, but also there's something more dignified about this sort of arrangement. And as you say, it's something that doesn't require an act of Parliament. It doesn't have to be debated by MPs to make it happen. And I think it can only be a good thing. And let's face it, if it's on long-term loan in Athens, it's not coming back. It's there, and it's probably going to stay there. So I guess we'll see what happens. But as I say, we've got a while till Orthodox Christmas, more than a month.
Well, let me just finish actually with this, a quote from the British Museum spokesperson in the Guardian. We'll link to the article, and it said, quote, the British Museum spokesperson said, quote, discussions with Greece about a Parthenon partnership are ongoing and constructive. Continuing, we believe this kind of long-term partnership would strike the right balance between sharing our greatest objects with audiences around the world and maintaining the integrity of the incredible collection we hold at the museum. I think they gave that comment walking on a tightrope. It's so balanced.
Yeah.
But I think that shows that if the British Museum is saying that, things are happening.
Yeah. And obviously we'll keep an eye on these things and report back when there's something to report.
Definitely.
What else do we want to bring our viewers' attention to?
Well, at the risk of playing to the conspiracy theory audience, which we would never want to do.
No.
But yesterday I found myself in the position of delighting in the fact that a traditional conspiracy theory was being taken out for another canter in the media. For months we've been on endlessly about Graham Hancock and pseudo archaeology,
Have
and
we?
then
I
the
hadn't
younger
noticed. I didn't.
Dryas.
I missed that.
Have you not been reading archaeological social media for the last few months since
For
Ancient Apocalypse 2,
the last 80 years of
America
my life.
Before or whatever dropped onto Netflix?
Yeah.
No? Oh, okay. Well, anyway. Dear reader, it has been happening, believe me. But yesterday we had a canter of the traditional Richard III, did he or didn't he bump off the princes in the tower conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
Because a Channel 5 documentary was publicising a claim that new evidence has been found in the National Archive, which offers a further evidence that Richard III did actually have his nephews bumped off. It's a document in a will from 1516 of a person called Lady Margaret Capel, who was connected with a man called Sir James Tyrrell through his wife. She was the half-sister of his wife. Tyrrell is the person who's named in Sir Thomas More as organising the murder of the princes. And the entry in the will reads, "I bequeath to my son Sir Giles his father's chain, which was the young King Edward V. That suggests that basically in that family there was a chain which at some point that family believed to belong to King Edward V.
Right.
Now, you will immediately spot the problem, which is that this will is dated to 1516, which I'll do the maths, and it's 26. It was around is 27. It's several decades after the princes disappeared. So you've got to fill that space. It's claimed that it belonged to the young King Edward V, Edward V being the older of the two princes. That's a claim. It's not verified. The family maybe believed that. There is this circumstantial connection with the traditional tale of the murder. It was found by a reputable historian, Professor Tim Thornton, who's the Deputy Vice Chancellor of the University of Huddersfield, and who was actually looking for clues to the belongings of the princes. What happened? Basically, they disappear in 1483 when Richard becomes king. It's known they were lodged in the Tower of London. They were never seen again, but as royal personalities, they would have had a household. They would have had possessions, clothes, jewelry, prayer books. None of that appears to have surfaced subsequently. So that's what Professor Thornton was looking for. He as he said, the clothes belongings just seem to disappear. No one ever seems to refer to them. But then he goes on. The debate over Richard III's responsibility for the disappearance of the princes in the tower will no doubt run and run, but we now have a unique reference to the survival of an object that was very personal to Edward V to add to the mix. Now, he doesn't make any claims that it solves anything.
No.
However, and in fact, there's an article in the journal History that he's authored, which goes on to discusses that in a measured sort of way. However, TV being TV, it was somewhat more, shall we say, assertive. The TV show was slightly more assertive. Basically, Channel 5 broadcast a documentary which went out under the title "Princes in the Tower: A Damning Discovery."
Okay.
Now, obviously, that's guaranteed to annoy the likes of Philippa Langley and the Richard III Society, and more of them in a minute. But basically, it showcased Professor Thornton's discovery, which it was said hadn't been shown before on television, certainly, and it was sort of front and center of the documentary. It was also picked up by other media. The Mail ran a story along the lines of "Princes in the Tower, murder solved at last."
Okay.
The murder solved at last being in quotes, with the quotes doing a lot of heavy lifting. So it's basically it's another piece of circumstantial evidence about the Richard III story, albeit an interesting piece of circumstantial evidence about the Richard III story. It doesn't really prove anything one way or the other.
No.
And it will run and run. But as I said, we'll link to it. Along with the Mail and the Channel 5 press releases on taking the traditional line. Several other authorities, including the Richard III Society, were somewhat more, shall we say, circumspect in their responses to what's turned up. So basically, no one who's invested in the Richard III story on either side really can sort of retire and forget about it, because it ain't over yet.
No. I won't talk about any individuals, but I would say that the Richard III Society is an interesting organisation in terms of how it's conducted itself in recent years. It seems to be less interested in just studying the time period, and at least publicly appears to be an active apologist for a version of the past that they want to be true. And I guess to a certain extent that's bound to be the case. It's named after the guy, and you don't want to necessarily be studying and supporting a baddie. But also as well, it's interesting how, as you say, that also leads to this ongoing opposition to evidence or ideas of evidence that goes against the narrative that they already want to present. I'm not quite sure how I feel about it, if you know what I mean. Because in other circumstances, I would be looking at a historian going, well, should we make any conclusions until we actually have evidence about these things, as opposed to trying to find evidence that supports your idea.
Yeah. It's a really interesting debate, that. I mean, all I'm going to say is that, and I've looked at the Richard III Society website a lot, and it's actually got some really useful stuff on it. Some good people do good research for the Richard III Society. At the same time, there are the groupies. It's 100 years old now. It's celebrating its centenary. And it's also it was set up as a partisan organisation. It was set up to, as they would see it, redress the balance of history which has been against Richard of Gloucester, Richard III, King of England.
Tudor propaganda.
Really, since he died. Really, since he died in August 1485 at Bosworth. And it's kept the story alive. The counter to the Shakespeare play, really. We saw recently The Lost King, the dramatisation of Philippa Langley's search for Richard III's body in Leicester, along with lots of archaeologists who were sort of arguably downplayed in the story. Again, a high-profile documentary this time on Channel 4, which we covered on the Watching Brief. People might like to look back on what we had to say about
the princes in the tower,
about lost princes, arguing the counter. Channel 5 one that just went out, that the princes, one or both of them, survived and were, touring around Europe trying to raise support, and possibly even led rebellions against Henry VII in the later 1480s and into the 1490s. So it's one of those. They're just, regardless. This document. It's interesting. It's not conclusive. However, it might have been dressed up for the documentary. It's not conclusive of anything, and it's circumstantial at best, like a lot of evidences, and certainly like a lot of historical evidences. And this isn't the. It's like the Loch Ness monster. You can't prove a negative, and so unless a document turns up where Richard says, "I did it," sorry, I'm gonna build a chapel in penance, something, and even then there are members of the Richard III Society who'd say that was a Tudor forgery. So we are where we are.
Yeah.
But it's the thing is, it's a good old-fashioned historical mystery tied up with historical conspiracy theory, and it's, in a sense, it's a. I hesitate to say this. It's a lot more fun than certain, rather more po-faced or violent responses. Although, yeah, well, I'll leave it there.
Okay, violent, crikey.
And verbally and in social media terms, and aggressive responses, should we say? That might be a better way of putting it.
Yeah, dismissive, and fair enough. Undoubtedly, Richard III will not go away, and neither will the Richard III Society. So we'll probably be talking about them again in the future.
When the next piece of bombshell evidence gets revealed that proves one way or the other. Yeah, exactly.
Indeed. Richard III owned a Mercedes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So now we come to Professor Lord Colin Renfrew, who passed away a couple of weekends ago now. The news was announced on the 25th of November, and I first saw it in a Greek newspaper. This was before it was being reported in the UK media. And I think it's a measure of how important his work has been and was and is internationally. It says, Colin Renfrew, renowned scholar of Cycladic civilization, dies. Professor Lord Colin Renfrew, a preeminent British archaeologist of prehistoric civilizations, including the Cycladic, has died aged 87. Renfrew helped to pioneer a cognitive approach to the field, playing a crucial role in shaping archaeology. He became known for his work on radiocarbon dating, the prehistory of languages, archaeogenetics, neuroarchaeology, and the prevention of looting at archaeological sites. He also played a major role in helping to start to scientifically date prehistoric sites across Europe. But one of the most noticeable bits of work that he did was on Malta. And actually, when I announced and shared this article on on Facebook, one of the things that really stood out was just how many people really felt close to Colin Renfrew in some way, partly because his name is literally on more or less the Bible when it comes to archaeology and students. I have, let's see, 1, 2, 3, snap. No? Hey, cool. So which is your edition?
Well, this is the thing. What we're talking about, dear viewer, is Renfrew and Barnes' Archaeology Theory, Methods and Practice, which is on pretty much every undergraduate reading list when you when you join an archaeology department.
Yeah.
And a colleague tweeted when Lord Renfrew's death was announced that archaeologists can date themselves. Dating evidence for their careers by which edition of Renfrew and Barnes they've actually got on their bookshelf. Well, I'm second edition, which was published in hang on a second, where's the title page? Got the wrong page. Second edition, which was published in
96, I'm guessing. According to this. Second edition, 1996.
Yeah, 96. Yes, 1996.
Yeah.
Thames and Hudson.
Yeah. I have a third edition, which is from the year 2000, reprinted in 2001. But this one was out of date when I got it. I was a poor archaeological student.
Oh,
I bought a copy which had pages falling out and all that sort of stuff.
Which, dear reader and dear viewer, should point you in the direction of how to question dating evidence, which is one of the most enduring contributions Lord Renfrew made to archaeology, because it was his work on calibrating radiocarbon, carbon-14, that really led to the revolution in dating prehistory. By cross-referencing dendrochronology from particularly the bristlecone pine in the United States, it was able to demonstrate that there were anomalies in the radiocarbon curves, and that things that have been dated to particular, particularly in the, I think it's, if I remember rightly, it's the second millennium BC, third millennium BC, where there are particular problems. But things were coming up in radiocarbon younger than they actually should have been when it's possible to cross-reference them with dendro. And that was revolutionary in terms of the archaeology of the period. And in fact, we mentioned at the top of the show that Professor Renfrew was one of the first working archaeologists I ever saw work. And that was because of a BBC series. And this is a book that was published by the BBC in the 1970s based on the series Chronicle. Archaeologists of a certain age, archaeologists of a certain age like me will remember Chronicle. It was the BBC's flagship archaeology series. When it didn't just give archaeologists GoPros and say, go and record it yourself. It actually went out and did field documentaries, and in fact followed field workers and even initiated field work. It also actually, funnily enough, we talked about conspiracy theory earlier on in connection with Richard III. They also went into conspiracy theory. The same book contains an article by Colin Renfrew about prehistoric societies and his models for prehistoric societies in Europe based on his work in the Pacific among Pacific Islanders. It also contains an article by Henry Lincoln, which is the first publication really of the conspiracy theory which became the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail.
Oh, I see.
A documentary. So if you can get anyone who can get, if you can get hold of a copy of Chronicle, I mean, you read the title page. You've got an introduction by Glyn Daniel, and articles by Colin Renfrew, but also Richard Atkinson, who's famous for his work at Stonehenge. And other leading archaeologists of the time. It's a cross section of sort of the archaeological great and the good, all male authors, I hasten to add. British archaeology in the mid 1970s. It's fascinating. But here's Colin Renfrew as a relatively young still archaeologist, making his career, making his groundbreaking contribution to the study of prehistory, which is already enough probably for one career. And yet he's got much, much more still to come, and ended up in one of the most prestigious posts in archaeology, which is Disney Professor of Archaeology at Cambridge, which was his main academic tenure.
Yeah, which always made me think that there must be a chair somewhere in Cambridge where there's these two big round discs for like a Mickey Mouse type thing. Disney Professor, but no, it's yeah, exactly. It can't really be understated how, I suppose, to put it into its broadest context, Renfrew was part of a generation of archaeologists who were interested in, you could sort of align it with modernism, I guess. This idea that the evidence could be interrogated, that you could account for example, variables such as carbon fluctuations in the atmosphere, get down to even more precise results based on evidence, and out of that evidence would come a solid touchstone for what we can say about how people lived in the past. You had this sort of positivistic sense of things like spatial analysis. He was involved in a study, I believe, on the Orkney Islands, in Orkney, where he posited territories for different groups of people in the late Neolithic based on locations of tombs and settlement locations. This was interesting work, the way that he tried to divide up space. He created a diagram that I remember being fascinated by as a first and second year student, which was this question of, and it's actually chapter 12 in my version of archaeological theories, methods, and practice, where societies are envisaged as being systems, almost like a wheel of different systems that each one affects each other. You have economics, you have farming, you have art, you have power, and so on and so forth. And the way in which these things interact may well lead to changes within systems of civilizations. He was interested, as you say, in dating techniques. And for the most part, I suppose what you could say is he was interested in what we can say without being too woolly about the evidence about how people lived in the past. This school, the processual school of archaeology, would be followed in the 80s by post-processualism, and that was a bit more interpretive, narrative-based, interested in the significance of things, semiotics, this kind of thing, and not just in what we understand about, say, the logistics of a landscape and where you can find resources and how people would have moved through that landscape according to our understanding of that landscape. Post-processualism would build in things like, well, perhaps this area was, even though there was a viable resource there, like flint, maybe a murder occurred and it became a taboo area. And this is why we don't see the flint being harvested in the way that you might expect. So, ideas moved on, but actually, to his credit, Renfrew moved with the times as well. He wasn't as bad as an awful lot of people of his generation for holding on to ideas that he held to be important to him.
I think that. I think that's one of the most important things about it. He wasn't an archaeologist who was influential in the past.
No,
he was working right up almost to the end of his life. In 2023, you quite rightly said that the theoretical basis of archaeology has been a moving target, if you like, for 40 years now. Renfrew began his career, really made his name, as you say, with the processual school, which was questioned, and things have been changed. But I think as a mark of just how important he was, 2023, the Theoretical Archaeology Group, TAG, I don't know if you've ever been to a TAG conference. I know I have. They're very entertaining, sometimes very high end, but
very exciting.
It's some really interesting stuff, really exciting thoughts and ideas come out at TAG. The Theoretical Archaeology Group gave now Lord Renfrew the inaugural prize for what they termed the outstanding contribution to archaeological theory. But I'd like to finish by talking about his practical contributions, but I never had the pleasure of meeting him, but I understand you did.
I did, yeah. Yeah, I was an undergraduate, and at that point I had a significant other who was studying down at Cambridge, or up at Cambridge, it depends on how you want to refer to it. And I was on the train, and I actually had my copy of the book on the table in front of me, and this gentleman sits across the table from me, and he doesn't look particularly interested in what I'm doing necessarily, for a moment at least. He's just reading a newspaper, but then he folds it up and just goes, "Oh, what are you up to? What's that you've got there?" And I'm, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, first year, just going, "Oh, well, I'm an archaeologist. I'm not yet an archaeologist. I'm still studying, but I'm an archaeologist." And he's like, "Oh, wonderful, wonderful." And he says, what are you interested in? I was like, "Oh, I don't know really yet. I'm not, but I do know I'm interested in," funnily enough, one of the things that actually later on an edited book would bring together essays from across decades of researchers and careers and generations of archaeologists to bring together a book in Renfrew's honour, all about specifically how things change. I didn't know this was the case, and I didn't know who I was talking to. So I said to him, "Oh yeah, I'm really curious about how things change, because why in the Neolithic why was irrigation invented, this kind of thing." And he goes, "Oh well, does anyone have any ideas about it?" And I said, "Well, there's this guy called Renfrew."
And we know where this is going. Yes.
This guy called Renfrew, and I start talking about how it's very much a characterization of him and some other people's work. This idea that systems make people do things, broadly speaking, for the benefit of the broader system. So almost as though, and I said to him, it's almost as though we're imagining that people wake up in the morning and go, "What would be best for my society and species right now? I know, I'll do some irrigation." And he goes, "Oh, so do you not think that happens?" And I was like, "No, I don't think that happens." Again, first year archaeologist, scarcely at university at this point. I say, "No, I don't think that happens." Who wakes up and says that? I think someone goes, "Hang on, my neighbour has access to a river. I want access to a river. I'm going to divert some water to my land." And these trends come about on an interpersonal basis, on a much lower level than sort of a highfalutin sort of societal response to the environment, for example. And I said, so yeah, really, I mean, Renfrew seems like like a good guy, but I'm not really sure. I'm not sure he's on to something. At which point he goes, "Right, very interesting. Okay, well, thank you for your time anyway." As we're pulling into Cambridge, so he gets off the train. I'm getting off. It's snowing, I seem to recall. Puts his hat on. He had a scarf, I think, as well. And I said, "Anyway, nice to meet you. My name's Marc." He goes, "Oh, wonderful. My name's Colin." And I'm like, "Okay, hello, Colin. Nice to meet you." And he walks off. And then someone who was across from me, who was an archaeology student at Cambridge, said, "That was Colin Renfrew, you dumb fuck." I was like, "No!" Oh my God, no. Apparently, all the way, people on the train with these other students were just looking at me like, "You idiot! Like, what are you doing?"
Oh, brilliant.
But to his credit,
Yeah.
he wasn't affronted by me. He seemed to be actually, in hindsight, genuinely pleased that someone was reading the book, was thinking about the work, was asking questions, and presumably that those questions would lead on to other things. And in my case, actually, it's fair to say that him positing systems analysis when it comes to civilizations actually led to me to develop what would become my dissertation, this idea of individual action, going down a slightly more sort of psychological and sociological rooted analysis of how things change, wouldn't have happened without his work. So as much as I never got to see him, I never saw him again. I never got to say, "I'm really sorry. I'm so sorry. I was just talking to you, like you were, a Joe Blogs." But in some ways, I'm glad I didn't, because actually what it meant was we had a very pure interaction, and that memory was seared into my mind. So yeah. In that sense, what I remember of him was a patient, fairly kind guy, and someone who wasn't so attached to his ideas that he just would flip the table and say, "You have no idea what you're talking about, you young upstart," this kind of thing. So yeah, good on him.
It's funny actually that comes across that sort of slightly sort of unassuming. There's also almost in your description there, particularly with the snow and the scarf. There's almost an element of George Smiley about it.
Oddly enough, yeah.
But no, I was thinking, and you were sharing a carriage with Colin Renfrew. Were you travelling first class? I'm sure you weren't. So
no. He just, I think the train was very full.
Right. Okay.
Happened just to sit down.
But no, it also ties in with an anecdote that another colleague was telling on social media about having dinner with Colin Renfrew at a conference, who was known to one of the other persons at the dinner, and we just said, "Oh, well, Colin will be joining us."
Uh-huh.
And it was just actually, this was a guy who's a master of Jesus College, a master of a Cambridge college, the elite of academia. But as my colleague said, he didn't have the lobster foie gras curry.
No,
but it was he could he would talk to people. He would mix with colleagues. He was interested in what other people had to say and so on. I mean, I never had the pleasure of meeting him under any circumstances, but I did see him in action though in his other role, one of his other roles, which I really like to finish off because we've talked about high-end archaeological theory and his influence on basic mechanisms of archaeology like dating and so on. But one of the other things that he became involved with, particularly in the latter part of his working, the main part of his working life, was looting and heritage crime. And he became an outspoken advocate for it in the British political system. Now, again, it's one of the contradictions of Colin Renfrew, that he was very much of the political establishment. He was a conservative. He was a lifelong conservative. He actually stood as a conservative candidate at one stage.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, had he become an MP, we probably wouldn't have had Colin Renfrew, the archaeologist.
No.
But by 2012, he was a working peer in the House of Lords. And it was at the time when Odyssey Marine Exploration and an organisation called the Maritime Heritage Foundation had cooked up an arrangement, a contract to commercially exploit the wreck of HMS Victory 1744. That's the HMS Victory that sank in a storm in October 1744. Odyssey had found it. The Maritime Heritage Foundation was set up, many people believe, as a front for Odyssey to be able to salvage the wreck against the policy of the UK government, which was to observe international norms as set down in the UNESCO Convention on the Protection of Underwater Cultural Heritage.
Mm-hmm.
There was a debate in the House of Lords about HMS Victory, and Colin Renfrew spoke for in defence of the archaeologists who were trying to prevent Odyssey and the Maritime Heritage Foundation going against UNESCO, trying to make sure that the government followed UNESCO.
Mm-hmm.
And in that, Renfrew, a working conservative peer, was speaking very directly against an organisation, the Maritime Heritage Foundation, that was fronted by a fellow conservative working peer,
Mm-hmm.
Lord Lingfield, Sir Bolton, Lord Lingfield. And so when I read you one of the things that Renfrew said in the debate about the HMS Victory case, you can see quite how prepared he was to sort of go against perhaps the best interest of the Conservative whip in terms of party unity.
Mm-hmm.
Because the crux of the case was that there was a commercial agreement between Odyssey and the MHF, which was contrary to the rules of the UNESCO Convention on the Protection of Underwater Cultural Heritage, which the British government said it upheld and used as the basis for its policy on maritime archaeology. And in part of his speech, attacking Odyssey, attacking the MHF and the commercial arrangement they'd come to, Lord Renfrew said this: "It's a significant test case because the UNESCO Convention on the Protection of Underwater Cultural Heritage makes it clear that the excavation of historic wrecks should not be financed by selling off the finds recovered, but that may be just what is now being planned for HMS Victory. If the government were to countenance such a practice," and this is a Conservative government, remember, this is David Cameron's government he's talking about, it's a Conservative-led coalition. If the government were to countenance such a practice, it would set a terrible example. It will give the wrong encouragement to other nations faced with similar responsibilities. It will be a tawdry thing to do with this great historic flagship of the Royal Navy.
Interesting.
Yeah. And the rest of his speech, again, we'll link to the passage in Hansard. It's worth reading in full because it's somebody who really cared and cared enough about the subject they loved and they're given their career to be so outspoken in the face of their own government and the actions of their own government.
Yeah. It's also worth pointing out there was a particular initiative that I was very much aware of as a student. Just one moment. There was that came out of the MacDonald Institute at Cambridge when he was the Disney professor there. He was Disney professor from 1981 to 2004. And in 1996, the Illicit Antiquities Research Centre, IARC, was launched at the Institute. And its mission was to research and raise awareness on the trade in illicit antiquities. Culture without context was the phrase that I was introduced to this by. I'll link to this below. There's a whole series of publication in PDF form. Unfortunately, after he retired from the position in 2004, the IARC was closed in 2007. So it's a measure of some of his interests that this came about when he was there and didn't long survive him. I mean, I suppose in that sense, I'm not sure. I think we are seeing the passing of a certain type of archaeologist, aren't we, in Britain in particular? Archaeologists whose careers were not untouched by colonial issues, shall we say? People who did have one foot in an establishment and one foot in the academic interests and career. I know I've been taught by a couple of similar men of a similar age in my time, and they are men. But I think there was a certain integrity and interest in almost the idea of archaeology and the idea of preserving the value of evidence for future scrutiny that was very clear in his work, and that is clear in similar archaeologists of a similar age. And I think it's one of those legacies that has been picked up and has been reinterpreted now with a decolonizing angle, and with an angle which is giving the interpretation and the integrity of that interpretation back to people. We've just been talking about, for example, at the beginning of this episode, conversations with Athens about the Parthenon Marbles, for example.
Yeah.
But I feel as though, even though towards the end of his career, when I was a student, he was in that sense establishment, and therefore he was there to be torn down. You see what I mean? He was there to be challenged, and I think he absolutely would have loved and did love that. I think the fact that people were still debating, still doing the work, still pushing it forward. I think the big push towards that sort of modernist, positivistic, science-led inquiry to try and bring together ideas based on evidence. I mean, one last thing I guess I would say was just something as simple as the understanding of how archaeological sites form. Renfrew was also part of that conversation as well. This idea about the so-called Pompeii premise. Is Pompeii preserved, as it were, literally as it was on the day that the volcano erupted? Or have things settled? Have things moved in the ground? What can we actually say about what we find, and how does that relate to that final day in the town? That sort of debate, simple debates as to what does it mean to find something in the ground and how does it relate to reality, were definitely pushed forward by that generation of archaeologists, and we all owe them gratitude, and in that sense, tip of the hat.
Yeah. I think it's another interesting sort of snippet of information. You talk about his contemporaries, the milieu that his career developed in. Two final points I think I'd want to make. I mentioned earlier the BBC Chronicle book, and one of the other people authoring that being Professor Glyn Daniel, who was sort of a generation ahead, the generation before Renfrew. But there you've got two archaeologists, one of whom is a pioneer of archaeology TV, Renfrew, who was quite happy to go on TV and tramp round with BBC camera crew of Magnus Magnusson in tow to talk about carbon dating in prehistoric societies for Chronicle. You read his output, and his academic output is staggering in terms of books and papers and so on, the influence of them. But there he is on the new medium as well, talking to audiences who aren't the traditional academic audience. And there's a lesson for us all there, I think. The other little interesting anecdote is that when he was at Cambridge in his own right, he went up for presidency of the Cambridge Archaeology Field Club, and he lost. But the person he lost to was Professor Sir Barry Cunliffe,
Mr. Big Ears himself. Yeah,
perhaps, or Yoda, as people have unkindly said. But no.
Although actually, in that sense, someone who went on to bat for the other team went to Oxford.
Well, we won't go. We won't go there. We won't go there.
Blimey!
But in a sense, Barry Cunliffe is still with us, thankfully. Possibly the last of one of the last of that generation. Certainly one of the last name archaeologists of that generation.
Yeah.
Andrew Colin Renfrew, Baron Renfrew of Camesthorne. 1937 to 24th of November 2024.
Yeah. Rest in peace.
An impressive and productive archaeological life.
Well, that, my friends, has been a watching brief. Thank you as ever for your time today, Andy. And if there's anything that you think we should be covering in the near future with regards to archaeological news, anything that you'd like to add to the conversation we've had today, please do comment below or get in touch. As ever, do consider checking out our Patreon, Andy's Ko-fi. Also, as well, check out the watching brief pin badges on the Etsy store. They're well worth bunging in, maybe, to a stocking or two.
Perfect stocking filler. Yeah,
Precisely.
The perfect stocking filler.
Yeah, stocking filler a go-go. But there we go. I think we have some ideas as to what we might be talking about next time. We do have a sort of special project to share with you guys, hopefully before Christmas, and hopefully also some sort of Christmas special. But we'll keep you informed as that happens.
And can I just add to what Mark said? I think particularly the main topic today has been the influence of the late Professor Colin Renfrew. If you want to join us with a comment below the line and how good, bad, indifferent, whatever, but how Professor Renfrew's work maybe influenced you, or did you have a close encounter like Mark did, or like I did,
Absolutely.
with Professor Renfrew? Please let us know.
And I suppose it's just worth finally saying I didn't quite get a chance to, but I would say that there was a huge number of comments left in response to the news of his passing. Wonderful, wonderful messages. So if that does continue below, I'll be very happy. Guys, until next time, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.